In 1948, the Convair 240 entered service with American Airlines on the route between New York and Chicago. The passengers who boarded it at LaGuardia stepped into a pressurized cabin at a time when pressurized cabins were still rare enough to be worth announcing. They flew at 18,000 feet, above the weather that had been shaking DC-3 passengers for a decade. The seats were wider, the aisle was level because the 240 sat on a tricycle undercarriage instead of a tail wheel, and a level floor meant passengers boarded without climbing, and every seat in the cabin felt like it belonged in a real aircraft. They landed faster than they would have on a DC-3, and the route held a load factor 8 percentage points higher than the comparable DC-3 service. American Airlines had ordered 75. 7 years later, on the 26th of October 1958, Pan American World Airways operated the first transatlantic jet service with a Boeing 707. The Convair 240 was still flying. It would keep flying for years. But the financial model that had justified every one of those 75 aircraft, the depreciation schedule, the revenue projections, the assumptions about how long this aircraft would remain competitive, had been invalidated by a machine that flew twice as fast and carried 4 times as many passengers. The Douglas DC-3 had entered service with American Airlines on the 26th of June, 1936, and by the end of the Second World War, it was the structural foundation of commercial aviation on every continent where scheduled services operated. More than 10,000 had been built in military and civilian variants. Operators across 6 continents had built their route networks, maintenance systems, and pilot training programs around it. It was also, by 1945, unfit for what post-war air travel was becoming. The DC-3 cruised at approximately 180 miles per hour at 10,000 feet, below most weather systems rather than above them. Its 2 Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines produced a cabin noise level that made conversation difficult without raising the voice. Its unpressurized fuselage meant passengers felt every altitude change as discomfort, and in turbulence, which at 10,000 feet was frequent, they felt everything. Seat pitch in most airline configurations was 32 inches. The tailwheel arrangement tilted the cabin floor backward several degrees on the ground, and the narrow fuselage meant the aisle was not wide enough for 2 people to pass each other. On routes of 3 hours or longer, the physical experience of flying the DC-3 was wearing, and the passengers who had discovered air travel during the war years, who now had money and a choice between modes of transport, were choosing between airlines on the basis of experience, not just schedule. American Airlines President C.R. Smith had understood this before the war ended. In 1945, his team produced a formal specification and sent it to every major U.S. airframe manufacturer. A twin-engine aircraft carrying 40 passengers, pressurized cabin, faster cruise, tricycle undercarriage, economics that sustained short-haul routes profitably. Convair, based in San Diego under the leadership of Harry Woodhead, submitted a design that met every requirement. Martin submitted the 202, which was competitive on most parameters but unpressurized in its initial form. Smith chose Convair. United Airlines President William Patterson reached the same conclusion independently. His airline ordered 55. Continental Airlines ordered 10. Western Airlines ordered 14. Trans-Australia Airlines placed an order. By the time the production run closed, 569 Convair 240s, 340s, and 440s had been built, numbers that confirmed how broadly the industry agreed with Smith's original assessment. The 240 those airlines received was powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engines, each producing 2,400 horsepower at takeoff. Combined output significantly greater than the DC-3's twin R1830s, and it cruised at 280 miles per hour at 18,000 feet. A route that took 3 hours and 40 minutes in a DC-3 was done in under 2 hours and 20 minutes. United Airlines published passenger satisfaction data in its 1949 annual report, recording a 23% improvement on 240-served routes compared to DC-3-served routes on the same corridors. The aircraft worked. The investment was rational given what was known. The only question was whether that rationale would hold long enough for the fleet to pay for itself. By the way, if you're into stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. United Airlines passenger satisfaction data could not fully capture what it felt like to board a Convair 240 in 1949 if a DC-3 was your only previous experience of commercial aviation. The pressurized cabin held at an equivalent altitude of 8,000 feet when the aircraft cruised at 16,000. No ear pain on climbs and descents. No oxygen equipment. None of the physiological heaviness that came from sustained exposure to low-pressure air at altitude. The windows were larger than the DC-3's small portholes, oval panels that gave a real view of the ground below and the horizon ahead. Seats arranged 2 and 2 across a fuselage 61 feet and 6 inches long. The belly-mounted baggage hold that replaced overhead bins freed the cabin ceiling and gave the interior a headroom and openness that felt, by the standards of the time, genuinely generous. Flight attendants on American Airlines 240 routes wore uniforms designed in consultation with the airline's marketing department, and the cabin service, coffee and meals on longer sectors, along with the deliberate presentation of the aircraft's modernity, was as much part of the product as the airframe itself. American Airlines had understood that passengers buying a ticket were not just buying transport from one city to another, they were buying an experience, and the 240 gave the airline something the DC-3 never had. An experience worth selling on its own terms. By 1951, the combined order book across all variants stood at 379 aircraft. Airlines had committed not just the purchase price, approximately $345,000 per aircraft in 1948 money, but the cost of new maintenance facilities, new crew training programs, new ground equipment, and revised route economics built on the assumption that this aircraft would serve them for at least 15 years. The commitment was structural. The Convair 240 had been written into the operational architecture of the airlines that bought it, and unwinding that architecture was not a decision any airline could make quickly or cheaply. American Airlines placed its initial order for 75 Convair 240s in 1946, with deliveries beginning in 1948. Under the depreciation model standard in U.S. commercial aviation at the time, the fleet would reach financial break-even, the point at which accumulated revenue exceeded combined acquisition, financing, and operating costs, sometime around 1963. 15 years of competitive mainline service, declining carrying cost, accumulating revenue. That was the model that made the investment rational. The Boeing 707 entered scheduled service on the 26th of October, 1958. Pan American's Juan Trippe had ordered it, Trans World Airlines' Howard Hughes had ordered it, BOAC had ordered the de Havilland Comet 4. The Douglas DC-8 entered service 3 weeks after the 707 in November 1958. On transatlantic routes, on transcontinental routes, on every trunk corridor where multiple operators competed, the jet had arrived, and passengers were choosing it. Load factors on jet-operated services outperformed piston-operated equivalents within the first 12 months of 707 service, and the gap widened through 1959 and 1960 as more jets entered the fleet and more passengers experienced the difference. A Boeing 707-120 cruised at 570 miles per hour, 35,000 feet. It carried between 141 and 179 passengers in standard configuration. Its operating cost per seat mile, despite a higher fuel burn, was lower than the Convair 240s because the denominator was 4 times larger. For every dollar of operating cost the 707 produced, 4 times as many seats shared it. The Convair 240's economics, competitive in 1948, were now not just uncompetitive, they were structurally unreachable. No efficiency improvement, no schedule adjustment, no fare restructuring could close a gap that wide. The depreciation clock on every Convair 240 in every American and United fleet was still running. The investment still had years of scheduled recovery remaining. The aircraft was still carrying passengers, still generating revenue, but generating it in direct competition with an aircraft that was faster by a factor of 2, carried 4 times as many people, and was chosen by every segment of the traveling public who had experienced both. C.R. Smith's purchase decision in 1946 had been rational with the information available in 1946. The information that was not available in 1946 was that a commercially viable jet transport would arrive within a decade. By 1959, the Convair 240 was caught between two pressures it could not escape. Below it, the Douglas DC-3 had not disappeared, it had simply reached full depreciation. Airlines still running DC-3 fleets were operating aircraft with acquisition costs recovered years earlier, at per-departure operating costs that no newer aircraft could approach on thin routes with low load factors. On regional services, where frequency mattered more than speed and passenger counts rarely justified a larger aircraft, the DC-3's zero carrying cost made it the practical choice regardless of age. The Convair 240 could not compete on those routes because its higher direct operating costs required load factors those routes could not sustain. Above it, the 707 and DC-8 had taken every route and every passenger segment where speed and capacity were the competitive variables, which by 1960 was the whole of the mainline domestic and international market. The 240 lost viability at both ends of the market at the same time, and there was no segment remaining where it held a structural advantage. American Airlines retired its last 240 from mainline scheduled service in 1966. United Airlines completed its phase-out in 1965. The aircraft moved to regional operators and commuter services, Allegheny Airlines, Mohawk Airlines, Lake Central Airlines, where its 40-seat capacity, short-field performance, and fully depreciated second-hand price produced a working life that stretched into the 1970s. Convair's own attempts to address the displacement produced the 340 in 1952 and the 440 Metropolitan in 1956, improved variants that sold reasonably well but resolved none of the underlying timing problem, because timing is not a specification deficiency and no variant can correct it. The Convair 580 turboprop conversion replaced the R2800 piston engines with Allison 501D13 turboprops, extended some airframes into the 1980s, and proved the soundness of the basic structure. But 131 converted aircraft was not the market the original program had been built around, and the conversion did not return the aircraft to mainline competition. It extended the operational life of airframes that had already been displaced. What the Convair 240 shows is a pattern that runs through aviation history with enough regularity to be a structural feature of the industry. The gap between the investment decision and the point of full financial return is long enough, 12 to 15 years in the post-war era, that a single technological disruption arriving at the wrong point in the depreciation cycle can invalidate the entire financial rationale of an aircraft program that was otherwise sound. C.R. Smith, William Patterson, and every other airline executive who ordered the Convair 240 made rational decisions with the information available to them. The NACA research that produced the swept wing geometry of the 707 was ongoing, but not yet published in forms accessible to commercial planners in 1946. The economics of the Pratt & Whitney JT3 turbojet were not available for route modeling until the aircraft it powered was already in testing. The investment decisions were made in the absence of information that did not yet exist. That is not a management failure. That is the condition under which all long-cycle capital investment operates. The Convair 240 solved the problem it was designed to solve, delivered the experience it promised, and generated the route economics it was built to generate. The problem was that the question it answered had been superseded by a different question before the answer had finished paying for itself. If this story was worth your time, hit like and subscribe, and drop what you think in the comments.